I've been watching dietary food guidelines very closely for decades, tracking every update, every revision, every quiet adjustment that most people never even notice. And I honestly never thought I would live long enough to see what I witnessed yesterday. For the first time in modern history, they didn't just tweak the food pyramid or shuffle numbers around the edges to make it look like progress, while keeping the same broken foundation intact. They didn't play the usual game of cosmetic wording changes or quietly moving percentages while pretending nothing fundamental had changed. This time, they flipped the entire model upside down, and that is not an exaggeration. This represents a massive shift, and yes, a massive win led by RFK Jr., because what just happened fundamentally challenges the nutritional dogma that has shaped our food supply, our institutions, and our health outcomes for more than 40 years. There are problems, and we are going to talk about them honestly, but overall, I am genuinely excited, because the implications of this change are enormous, especially for children in schools, for hospitals, nursing homes, military food programs, prisons, and every institutional setting that feeds millions of people every single day. These institutions will not be able to simply swap one label for another and move on. They will be forced to completely rewire their supply chains, rethink procurement, and reconsider what they have been calling food for decades. And to understand just how radical this shift really is, you have to understand where we came from and how deeply embedded the old model was in every layer of society. For over 40 years, the foundation of official dietary guidelines was built on grains being the base of the diet. I'm talking about 6 to 11 servings of grains every single day, presented not as an option, but as a necessity. Entire generations were taught that carbohydrates were the cornerstone of health, that bread, cereal, pasta, rice, and grain-based products should dominate every plate. The food pyramid, in every version before this, was constructed on that assumption. Carbohydrates were king, fat was the enemy, cholesterol was portrayed as dangerous, saturated fat was demonized, and protein was treated almost like a secondary nutrient you didn't need much of. Calories were the central focus, with the simplistic and deeply flawed idea that calories in equals calories out, as if the human body were a mechanical engine rather than a complex hormonal and metabolic system. But yesterday, with this release, they walked away from that entire model. They didn't adjust a few numbers or soften a sentence. They talked about the food itself, and that alone is enormous. That signals a philosophical shift away from abstract nutrient math and toward biological reality. And this didn't happen because of opinions or political pressure alone. The data has been accumulating for years, even decades, to the point where it simply became impossible to ignore anymore. The chronic disease explosion has reached such catastrophic levels that denial is no longer sustainable. For the first time, ultra-processed foods were placed directly in the crosshairs and identified as a primary driver of roughly 90% of chronic disease. We are talking about obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and countless inflammatory conditions that now affect children at rates that would have been unthinkable just 2 generations ago. For decades, ultra-processed food companies were protected by silence, ambiguity, and carefully crafted language that allowed them to market engineered products as healthy choices. That protection is now gone. This is no longer about cosmetic wording or clever marketing. The document contains some very direct, very hard statements that clearly identify the problem. I'll put a link down below so you can read it yourself, because it's important to understand that this is not subtle. To really appreciate the magnitude of the shift, we have to compare the old model with the new one, and understand what is being abandoned and what is being embraced. Under the old model, 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates per day were recommended, which is an enormous carbohydrate load when you understand how carbohydrates function metabolically. These carbohydrates rapidly break down into glucose, driving blood sugar spikes and insulin surges throughout the day. Alongside this, people were told to eat low fat, avoid cholesterol, and restrict saturated fat, all while being told that weight gain and disease were simply a matter of consuming too many calories. The focus was never on insulin, never on hormonal signaling, and never on food quality. Under the new recommendations, the target is clear. Ultra-processed foods are the enemy of health. The emphasis is now on real food, on increasing protein intake, and not just plant-based protein, but high-quality animal protein, including red meat, which for decades was treated as something to fear rather than something that nourishes. This alone represents a seismic shift in thinking. Previously, protein recommendations were set at about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. For a 180-pound person, that translates to roughly 65 grams of protein per day, an amount that is barely sufficient to prevent deficiency and certainly not enough to support optimal health, muscle maintenance, metabolic function, hormone production, and tissue repair. Under the new guidelines, protein intake is recommended at 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. That same 180-pound person is now looking at approximately 98 to 131 grams of protein per day, nearly double what was previously advised. This is a massive shift, and it matters because I can tell you from decades in this field that a huge percentage of the population is deficient in high-quality protein. That deficiency impacts everything from blood sugar regulation and insulin sensitivity to hormone balance, immune function, bone density, and cognitive health. Simply correcting protein intake alone has the potential to dramatically improve biochemistry and metabolic stability for millions of people. What becomes incredibly interesting, and also incredibly challenging, is how these recommendations are going to be implemented in the real world. When you officially identify ultra-processed foods as the primary enemy of health, you are directly challenging the foundation of the modern food supply. Over 50% of the calories consumed today come from ultra-processed foods. Entire supply chains, agricultural subsidies, manufacturing systems, and distribution networks are designed around producing shelf-stable, highly profitable, engineered products. Schools, hospitals, military bases, and nursing homes are built around these systems. Changing this isn't as simple as swapping one ingredient for another. It requires a fundamental restructuring of how food is sourced, prepared, and delivered. And while the recommendations are promising, the reality of implementation remains uncertain. Another delicate but critically important issue is definitions. Right now, they are still working on how to define ultra-processed foods, and if I had any input in this process, I would start somewhere entirely different. Instead of immediately arguing about what qualifies as ultra-processed, I would start by redefining what food actually is. That may sound simple, but it's not, because the definition of food was quietly altered decades ago and turned into a legal definition rather than a biological one. Under the legal definition, food is essentially anything edible with a shelf-stable life. That definition has nothing to do with nourishment, health, or biological function. The biological definition of food is something entirely different. Food is that which sustains life, promotes growth, and supports the repair of body tissues. Without returning to that foundational biological definition, it becomes impossible to meaningfully distinguish food from non-food. If we simply restored that definition and declared that anything that does not support life, growth, and repair cannot be called food, the entire conversation would change overnight. Awareness would shift instantly. People would begin to realize that many things they put in their mouths are not food at all, but industrial products that actively create disease. Whoever controls definitions controls outcomes, and this is true not just for food, but also for drugs and disease, as I've discussed in other presentations. With all of the positive developments in these new guidelines, there is still one massive missing piece, and it is arguably the most important one: insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the root cause of most chronic disease, and while some of the recommended changes will indirectly help prevent it, the guidelines do not directly address how to reverse it in people who already have it. This matters because prevention and reversal are not the same thing. Correcting insulin resistance requires more than just changing what you eat. It requires changing how often you eat. If someone switches to healthier foods but continues to eat 3 meals a day with multiple snacks and constant grazing, insulin remains elevated throughout the day. Even healthy foods stimulate insulin, and chronically elevated insulin makes it nearly impossible to reverse insulin resistance. Prevention may occur, but reversal likely will not. To reverse insulin resistance, two factors are non-negotiable: lowering carbohydrate intake and reducing eating frequency. This is where intermittent fasting becomes critical, yet it is completely absent from the new guidelines. Insulin resistance was not mentioned at all, and that omission is telling. Acknowledging it would require admitting that decades of dietary advice actively contributed to the problem. Recommending 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates per day guarantees frequent insulin spikes, and if insulin resistance were openly discussed, the entire calories in, calories out model would collapse. That model ignores hormonal responses and focuses only on energy math, which does not reflect human physiology. History shows us that when guidelines are proven wrong, apologies are rarely offered. Cholesterol limits were quietly removed in 2015 after 40 years of fear-based messaging, but no acknowledgement of harm was made. Finally, there is the issue of saturated fat. Unfortunately, the new guidelines still cap saturated fat at 10%, which remains problematic. When saturated fat is restricted, something has to replace it, and that replacement is almost always unsaturated fats from refined seed oils. While the document does criticize ultra-processed foods and refined oils, it does not adequately address oxidation, storage instability, or the inflammatory nature of industrial seed oils. Another omission is the term industrial starches. While refined carbohydrates are mentioned, most people don't realize that ingredients like wheat flour, modified cornstarch, modified food starch, and maltodextrin are essentially hidden sugars. Maltodextrin, in particular, raises blood sugar more aggressively than table sugar, yet it is often labeled as sugar-free. These industrial starches must be eliminated if we are serious about reversing chronic disease. Despite these shortcomings, I am genuinely ecstatic about this flip of the food pyramid. This is the most hopeful shift in nutritional policy I've seen in my lifetime, and if implemented properly, it has the potential to dramatically improve the health of an entire nation. I'm extremely curious to hear what you think about this, so leave a comment below and let me know your perspective. I also have a free download for you, which is my daily routine checklist. This is the routine I use every day to feel like I'm 18 years old, even though I'm 60, and I want to give it to you completely free. There's a link down below, so make sure you grab it. And because intermittent fasting is the single biggest missing piece from these new guidelines, if you haven't implemented it yet or don't fully understand it, you need to watch the next video right now, because it will walk you through exactly how to do it and why it matters more than almost anything else you can do for your health.